Welcome everyone to this virtual seminar organised by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England in collaboration with the Society for Medieval Archaeology. We're organising these virtual seminars to showcase the awesome research that's going on within our field, ranging from linguistics to literature to archaeology to art history, and we're very happy to be organising these sessions, especially when we can collaborate with other societies within our field. And today we're very lucky to be joined by the Society for Medieval Archaeology, and it's my absolute pleasure to hand over the digital floor to Professor Oliver Creighton, who is a Professor of Archaeology at the University of Exeter, but more importantly, he's also the President of the Society for Medieval Archaeology. Oliver, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you so much for putting this event on. And I think collaboration is so important for archaeological research. It's great to see the event set up in this way. So I really have two jobs, and I'm going to keep things quite brief. First of all, I'm going to say a few words of introduction about the Society for Medieval Archaeology, and then the main business of the day, I want to hand over, I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Duncan Wright. The first thing I'd like to do is just very briefly share my screen. So this is the web page of the Society for Medieval Archaeology. If you can't see the web address, it's medievalarchaeology.co.uk. It's the web page of a society that was established in 1957, many years ago, to further the understanding and research on unwritten evidence, i.e. material evidence, for the period between the 5th and the 16th centuries AD. So that's the mission of the society. In terms of what we do, we run conferences. We run an annual conference. Last year's conference was a collaboration with the Society for Medieval Archaeology and the Portable Antiquities Scheme at the British Museum. This year's conference is going to be held in Leicester in September, and its focus is on urban archaeology. So we run annual conferences. We're very, very keen to promote early career researchers and postgraduate researchers involved in medieval archaeology research. So we have a symposium dedicated to early career researchers and postgraduates. That's going to be held in Exeter in July of this year. We give out grants to support high quality research in medieval archaeology. And we have a newsletter that comes out twice a year. I'd also like to advertise that we encourage people to join up. Details of membership are available on the website, but I don't want to make this overwhelmingly, a pitch for people to join the society. But I'd still encourage it. Very key function of the society is to produce our journal. The Society for Medieval Archaeology produces the flagship journal, Medieval Archaeology, since 1957. And there's a link here because our speaker today, Dr. Duncan Wright, is the current editor of Medieval Archaeology. He took over the job last year. And really to make a pitch here, we're always looking for high quality submissions to the journal. Details on how to submit, you can find links on our webpage. So that's just a few words about the Society for Medieval Archaeology that I have the great honour of being the president for. So I'd like to hand over to Duncan in a moment. So as I say, Dr. Duncan Wright is the honorary editor of the journal Medieval Archaeology, and he is a senior lecturer in medieval archaeology at the University of Newcastle in the northeast of England. Duncan's undergraduate career started at the University of Exeter. His master's was at the University of York, and he returned to the University of Exeter for his PhD in early medieval archaeology. He then moved on to a research fellow position on a Leverhulme Trust funded project on the so-called anarchy of the 12th century in England. His first lectureship was at Bishop Grosseteste University in Lincoln, and then he moved to the Newcastle University in 2020. He's published incredibly widely, has an incredible publication record, largely focused on the following areas: on medieval settlement research and landscape research, research into elite power, research into sacred landscapes. And it is no coincidence that those interests all really coincide with the topic of today's lecture, which is entitled Where Power Lies, Lordly Centres in the Landscape of Early Medieval England. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Olin, and thanks everyone for the invite to speak. It's a real pleasure to speak to both societies. I'm going to try and share my screen. As brilliant, fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. It's really good to see so many people, and as I said, speak to two societies rather than one as well. It's a real privilege. I'm going to share today some results from a recently completed research project. As Ollie says, it's called Where Power Lies. Very much an archaeology project, but actually I want to start this discussion not with archaeology, but with a bit of etymology instead. And looking at the history of use and the history behind the word rich. And most people are pretty comfortable with the definition of that in modern English. It's of a person who is, the OED has it as of a person having money, abundant assets, basically being sort of distinct from being poor. Why we're starting here, though, is that the history of rich is really very interesting and very significant for this project and what it tells us, because actually rich in its original Old English meaning was quite different, and probably different until the middle of the 10th century. So rich in Old English originally actually meant powerful or great, and it's only across the course of the 10th century, certainly by about 950, and certainly by the third quarter of the 10th century, that it gets its more modern meaning. Then actually rich becomes associated not with just powerful people, but people who are actually then expressing wealth and conspicuous wealth. What this tells us, while we're starting with this etymology, is actually that's a key transformation in society. It's speaking to a change in the fabric of the aristocracy that we see around this period, where the aristocracy is more diverse. There are more of them. There's a plethora of newly rich people. And that's really a fundamental change in society. It's something we see in early medieval England, but also across other parts, especially of Western Europe, around the same time. And this project, Where Power Lies, is really trying to understand one key component, archaeological component particularly, of this transformation, of this growth, of this newly wealthy and rich class of people. And this is through these things that we call lordly centres. And Christopher Lovelock has suggested that these centres that we're looking at are the key sort of theatres of consumption, where rich people essentially displayed sometimes their newly found wealth, but sometimes more established wealth. It's a project that ran for a couple of years, very much a collaborative project. You'll see a familiar face there. A co-investigator was Oliver Crichton, so I'm very much privileged position to be sharing results from lots of people's efforts. It was a collaboration between Newcastle University, the University of Exeter, and the Portable Antiquities Scheme. And we have lots of sort of contributors to different components of the project, and you can see them down there. The origins of the project, though, really lie in a pilot scheme that I led a few years ago at a site called Lawton and Lamorthen, which is in South Yorkshire. I was brought to Lawton because it had a kind of it was really sort of obviously low-hanging fruit for an archaeological project, because here at Lawton we've got a lovely, beautifully preserved Motte and Bailey. You see it in an awful lot of the literature. You also see in the scholarship quite frequently that people have said in the Domesday Book, this is the site of Earl Edwin's Aula, and this is probably a hall. The meaning of Aula and its interpretation is debated. Many of the things I'm speaking about today I'm going to have to elide the detail, and maybe we can explore in the questions. But many people had assumed at Lawton that Earl Edwin's Aula must be sort of lying somewhere close to the castle, maybe underneath it. And having a decent chunk of experience in geophysics and excavation, I thought we could sort of test this method. Other indications that we're looking at a pre-conquest high-status site preceding the castle was the very chunky porticus in the standing church, sort of early medieval in date, but also within the village itself there are excavations that have been undertaken earlier that demonstrated early medieval activity as well. So combination of geophysics in the first part. We did some standing building survey of the church as well. We then identified through especially the earth resistance that we had a lovely sort of enclosure that looked like it was projecting underneath the castle. This looked in terms of form to be early medieval in origin. We slotted that and actually found the enclosure ditch, and essentially we're pretty certain there's a lot more to this research project than I'm showing, but we were pretty certain that we have you know, sort of a late pre-conquest high status residence, indeed Earl Edwin's power base, with that kind of binary church and residence, high status residence side by side at Lawton. We commissioned some lovely reproductions from Pickle Archaeological Illustration. We think this is the pre-conquest phase, and then probably quite soon after the conquest, a castle is then constructed right on top of Earl Edwin's residence. The church actually retained for some time, but the residence is drastically transformed. So this was published as a separate piece of work, but I think Lawton really showed the kind of the potential of doing some dedicated study to these sites, but also looking at these sites not particularly from a sort of especially castle point of view. The castle component is often very, very interesting, but actually these lordly power centres, there's an awful lot of new data that can be generated through a dedicated archaeological project. And so that was the real kind of the lightning rod moment, I suppose, for developing a more comprehensive nationwide research project. So Where Power Lies was initiated with that in mind, trying to gather together all the kind of the national data sets we had, but also working at a number of smaller scales as well to sort of explore some of the archaeological signatures of these power centres in more detail. Now we call these things lordly centres. They're very kind of slippery in terms of definition. You'll see people use lots of different terms to describe them. And so we've tried to go for a kind of a catch-all approach that includes things like later castles, but pre-conquest precursors, and pretty much everything in between. So we're looking at trying to apply a definition that encompasses everything, that it's not specific to a particular period or a particular landscape. We did focus particularly on the rural sites, and we were very interested within that at places where you seem to see places like Lawton, where you get that sort of twinning of residential component and ecclesiastical component in quite a discrete area. These places are very important, as I've already alluded to. These sort of theatres of consumption. They're places where the economy is very much organised in the rural landscape, where parts of the landscape were effectively planned in some instances, and social controls exerted. Sometimes, especially in the post-conquest period, we see them being sites of manorial courts as well, but on the flip side could act as foci of resistance as well. They do tap into something broader that's going on as part of the feudal revolution, this ensoleillement kind of process that we see in Europe. It's debate, it's a huge area of debate here in terms of how much England looks like the continent and how it's distinctive. Again, I don't have the time to go into that, but essentially just to emphasise that we're not just looking at these sites on their own for the interest that they hold, but actually they're part of a broader phenomenon, and they speak to lots of different debates, especially historical debates, and they have relevance there. As I said, we call them lordly centres, but there's no consistent name. We're trying to sort of change that through the project. So we looked at various different data sets. We tried to characterise lordly centres, generate new information on them at a variety of scales. Now, in the 15-20 minutes that I've got left, I'm going to try and very quickly summarise some of the key findings of those different scaled approaches for you. Before I do, just a note on castles. I'm about to speak I think later in the year to the Castle Studies Trust, so I want to make sure that I get this right, in that, especially with Ollie on board, we're very much interested in castles, but we're interested in them as part of a broader phenomenon of lordly centres. Of course, castles are distinctive, they're very important, and I think that the first reference to a castle in English that's down there is really significant. It's clearly seen as something distinctive going on in the English landscape with the introduction of the castle. But it's also fair to say that on the flip side, castles have often overshadowed the study of lordly centres more broadly. So that kind of almost obsession with classification, with defence in particular, has sometimes sort of overshadowed other areas of potential research. So we were looking at castles when they sort of fell within the 800 to 1200 date range of the project, but we've seen them as part of a broader phenomenon rather than particularly seeing them as distinctive. Now, in terms of mapping lordly centres, we started off the project with a huge data sweep, as many national data sets as we could possibly find. We very kindly had data from the corpus of Romanesque sculpture, the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture as well, shared their data sets. We've been developing, Ollie and I, for some years, data sets of early castles as well. They were all sort of integrated into a large project database. Very useful. It was very handy to have it all in one place. You started to see potentially regional distributions, but it's quite immediately apparent that these data sets were as much a kind of reflection of sort of modern research trends as they were of any kind of historical distinctiveness or reality. So we quite quickly realized that we'd have to bury down into different data sets in more detail to try and find more meaningful patterns. It should also stress that we were using the Portal Antiquity scheme for this process as well. We're very lucky to have some of the data, for example, from the Warhorse project that Ollie's led, but also bringing our own data sets to bear as well and creating sort of a national GIS picture. So in terms of trying to bury down into greater detail, we looked at two macro regions. This is where we looked at what we call the historic environment records, the records held by counties in much more detail to try and firstly identify these lordly centres and the evidence for them, but clean that data and create sort of far more coherent data sets and start to sort of bury down and see what they look like on the ground and whether we could start to characterise them a bit further. Some of the patterns we started to see in this analysis are really quite interesting. One of the first ones we picked up on was that actually you're getting lots of lordly centres in areas of low settlement density. Now, again, this is a very complex area, but that kind of bucks a certain trend. I think typically lordly centres are often seen as part and parcel of broader seigneurial landscapes in which they're part of a nucleated settlement. But actually, our data started to suggest that there's perhaps more balance to that actually we're still getting lordly centres in areas where the settlement density was quite low, and actually settlements were probably more likely to be dispersed. So that kind of image of the nucleated village with a manorial centre at its core, or the top end, for example, has perhaps been overemphasised in scholarship. We're starting to see that in the data. The other thing we picked up on that was really significant is the correlation between these sites and watercourses as well. Of course, there's obvious reasons for that. It's domestic use, irrigation, all the rest of it. But also, we're pretty sure that the correlation has something to do with water mills as well. You can see some of the more detailed mapping we did for Wiltshire and Hampshire here. This is residential sites and ecclesiastical sites and the major watercourses of those two counties. And you often see them, these sites being really quite closely located, or not just watercourses, but quite substantial ones as well. And we believe, and as soon as we sort of started looking at these sites in more detail, the amount of times that we saw later mills on these sites, either integrated into them or actually forming part of a boundary. The watercourse is often forming a boundary and the mills are on them. We think a lot of the time it's very hard to prove that probably the mills are established as a part of the component of the lordly centre from the very outset. So milling is clearly very, very important. Archaeologically very hard to find and to excavate. There's some important work actually at Raunds in Northamptonshire and trying to excavate mills, but it seems really significant that mills are a component of these early centres. I suppose what many people find the most interesting, though, rather than these national stories, which can tell us something, is the more kind of, I suppose, biographical approach, the more detailed sites that we looked at. So we looked at 7 of these in real detail. We actually undertook an 8th at Earl's Barton, but we're still working through the results of that. And these were examples that we thought had really great potential, and we explored these in far more detail. So we did, very thorough desk-based research, but also lots of fieldwork, topographic survey, geophysical survey. We've done some very limited excavation on them as well, incorporating the PAS analysis, but also standing building assessment, because we're very lucky in the project that we could do that. We're often looking at landscape archaeology, but with standing buildings as well, so that could be brought to bear on our understanding. So I just want to sort of finish with 2 examples of these detailed case studies. One of which you might have seen in the press, because it got quite a lot of press attention when we did the release, was Bosham in West Sussex. Now, Bosham is famous for being depicted on the Bear Tapestry. It's where Harold is shown as sort of riding to Bosham from Westminster, then attending the chapel and then feasting in the hall. It might be depicted twice. It might be that actually when Harold returns from Normandy slightly later in the scene, it might be that this sort of enigmatic building here at the top of the screen is actually at Bosham as well. We can't be sure. But Bosham has got this, very kind of famous association with the tapestry. It's the Earl Godwin's centre before Harold's, and such we know, and it's sort of popular opinion, local opinion, kind of knew where this lordly centre was. The significance for us, I suppose, with the tapestry is that we don't have any other depictions in art really like that for this period, and it also really serves to emphasise that kind of binary association between church and residence that we're really looking to explore in the project. So as I said, Bosham it's a fascinating site, but no one had really before tried to pin down exactly where this site was located. So where was Harold's residence? Is it in the centre of the village as a local tradition had it? And a bit like Lawton, can we use archaeological methods to demonstrate that? The PAS data was useful in this regard. Some of the distributions on the peninsula in particular, along with the place names, it probably shows that there's a kind of a hunting chase attached to the village and probably the lordly centre in it. But really the majority of the work we were doing at Bosham was things like geophysics, the standing building assessment, but also at Bosham looking through a historic archive proved absolutely crucial to understanding this site. So we did lots of survey throughout the village, but really it was area A that we ended up focusing on, a large house in the centre of the village, clearly an area of significant potential. And as I said, it is almost a sort of local tradition that, yeah, that's where Harold's residence is. But no one had really sought to prove that with any certainty. So the standing building survey was an important component of all this. The listed building assessment and most other assessments of this house are that it is 18th century, and it is. But as soon as we entered the house and Michael Shapland was leading this interpretation, it was clear that there were medieval components in the house. The first one you could see, walked through the front door, there's a medieval wall facing you. We then had medieval timbers reused in different parts of the house, including a crown post from a medieval hall. Different components as well. That this stairwell seems to be mostly reused medieval timbers. Blackened timbers from an open hall as well, very diagnostic. And also on the outside of the house, a wonderful sundial, which is very sort of typical of these lordly centres. We find these sort of tide dials are quite hard to date a lot of the time. But we find these integrated often to these lordly centres. This one's been reused in the 18th century house. So already there was more to this location than being like an 18th century and later house. Michael had this interpretation from his work that there's probably 2 phases, medieval phases of the house, and then subsequent phases as well. But then also sitting in the garden of this very nice house was this building known as the Garden Ruin. And again, most people who'd commented on this had thought it was 18th or 19th century romantic ruin. To our eyes, it looks more like it's potentially 12th century in origin. It's not pre-conquest, but it seems to have in situ lancet windows. They bear very close comparison with an example not too far away at Christchurch in Hampshire, which looks like a very sort of similar building type as well. Actually, part of the chimney that you get at Christchurch, similar component to that was actually found at Bosham as well. Just checking the time. This chimney, in fact, was actually found in excavations at Bosham in 2006, and those excavations are absolutely crucial for pushing our evidence for substantial, high-status 12th century and later buildings on the site, for pushing that chronology back to before the conquest. So these excavations were actually commissioned by the owners of this house, who were interested in the local stories that Harold's residence was actually in their garden, and got West Sussex Archaeology and George Annelay to lead excavations not only in their garden, which is potentially quite destructive, but also within their house as well. So real keen enthusiasts. And George's work identified an awful lot of archaeology, including pre-conquest activity, a series of enclosed ditches, which are very important for defining the boundaries of what we think the Lordley Centre is, what look like medieval buildings within the house as well. But the real sort of, I think, the clinching piece of evidence for us was that to the south of the house, they seem to identify a timber building, and within the timber building, or at least close to it, it's quite difficult because you're looking at small slots here and reconstructing a building on the basis of that. But you definitely have beam slots suggesting a large timber building, but then what looks like an incorporated latrine. Why is that important? Why is it significant? Well, both Gabble Thomas and John Blair have commented that it's only really around the year 1000 that you start to get integrated latrines, and in very, very high status houses, in sort of certainly royal houses, but aristocratic houses as well. And it seems that at Bosham we seem to have that. That's really quite important for identifying this as a very high status pre-conquest site. So you can actually see the cesspit of the latrine there, that sort of odd colouring. Even after all that time, it's still coloured very differently. But this was a crucial piece of evidence for us that with confidence we could associate this really with the Godwinsons' residence. The press picked up on this, not just the kind of the Harold story, but they absolutely loved the kind of toilets component of it. So it absolutely went wild in terms of the coverage for that. So we say we got a gutter press, and maybe that's some evidence for it. So we were really happy with this outcome. We think it's really quite significant. The archive itself is fascinating too. The remaining archive from those excavations. What's significant there is the quantity of Roman material that we have on the site, as well as early medieval and later medieval material as well. And that's how we reconstructed the enclosure complex at Bosham. And essentially, we think we've got a core pre-conquest area sort of located probably around here. This blotch at 4, unfortunately, is where there was extraction of clay and gravel in the historic period. So it's probable that the majority of Harold's residence and his father's residence has been removed by that process. And we seem to get an expansion from that core and going across the enclosure ditch in a slightly later period, and that's why we've got medieval material in the standing house. So we're relatively confident that we've located the residence of Harold Godwinson. And again, it's one of those things we thought was an obvious target to go for, and this is the reconstruction. It's interesting that the Bosham, like several of our sites, actually looks like this process of secularization, where you seem to have a monastic precinct that is being kind of developed into by the aristocracy around this time. We see that places like Deerhurst, for example. We think we've got that going on at Bosham as well. So the second and final example I want to touch upon, quite different to Bosham in that it doesn't have nearly the kind of documentary coverage, but a site of real potential. And again, it's a story that is continuing to run a little bit in I'm going to be leading excavations here this summer, is at Saintbury in Gloucestershire, really emphasising the kind of state of research into lordly centres, I think, is that this is clearly a site that is remarkable in terms of potential, but also preservation, but had not really been looked at before. We had been important sort of commentators in terms of the place name and also mapping very sort of briefly the archaeology of the site, but it'd never been mapped by the Ordnance Survey. It hadn't been, the site hadn't been scheduled, and it's kind of not really on the radar. And I think that really speaks to that these lordly centres are hard to characterise, they're quite hard to define. And it's defined, St. Brie, by this absolutely incredible earthwork complex. You can see the ridge and furrow extending north of the church there, but then you've got this amazing curvilinear structure. You can see that on the LiDAR too, but also a very, very busy complex of earthworks right next to the church of St. Nicholas here. It's a really, really remarkable site. So we thought this was a site we had to explore more. It's interesting that most commentators and us included thought we might be looking at a lordly centre that has essentially been deserted, and this might be sort of preserved in aspect. It's been really kind of a short-lived thing, and we could quite a unique chance to study it. Our researchers showed a much more complex picture, but I think an interesting picture. I wanted to emphasise how amazing the location of this place is. You get no sense of that really, but we're halfway down the Cotswold Scarp. We're at the northern part of the Cotswold Hills. You can stand with your back facing south and essentially get a 180 panorama of the Vale of Evesham, uninterrupted. The Malverns to the west and Birmingham to the north. It really is a remarkable place. Our work confirms what we have been quite well established already, that we have a church probably of about 1100 on the site, but there are indications of earlier activity, potentially an earlier church as well. Might be a pre-conquest sundial. We think this is actually reset above the early Norman doorway, but also bits of sculpture, one that's sort of lying within the church itself. This has been called a Sheila na gig. We're not entirely convinced by that. That seems to have been defaced, but also there's quite distinctive, pre-conquest style double lancet window. That this is meant to be somewhere in the village. We don't exactly know where, but removed from the church in the 1960s and reintegrated into somebody's house in the village. So maybe this summer we'll actually pin down what it is, but hints here of a pre-conquest church on the site. Our geophysics sort of both sides of the church showed the great potential of it and how much archaeological activity was going on. I don't have the time to go into the details, but clearly what looks like a substantial building, or probably buildings, southwest of the church, it looks on a very similar alignment to St. Nicholas Church, which might really be quite significant. But also our photogrammetry with our drone, creating these very cool 3D models, allowed us to understand the earthworks in much more detail. We undertook OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence, which was led by Tim Kinnaird of St Andrews University. This is a method by which we can date sort of stratigraphic horizons, and not through material culture, but actually through the soil itself. And that, along with some of the finds we made during the excavations to get those samples, started to build a much more complex picture. The OSL actually showed that big sweeping boundary around the outside, this thing here, probably originated in the Iron Age, and perhaps a circular enclosure within it as well. It is then added to between the 7th and 9th centuries AD, and then it seems to be sort of left and not added to after that point, which is really very interesting. Building on that and trying to develop a sense of what's happening on the site, we actually think it's probable the site originates in the Iron Age as a banjo enclosure in the late Iron Age. Not only the OSL and the morphology of the site support that, but also its landscape location as well, being halfway down a hill slope overlooking a dry valley, all very typical of Iron Age sort of banjo enclosures. You then clearly have a Romano-British element as well. All of that pottery we were getting is clearly sort of Roman activity. We're not suggesting the banjo enclosure remains in use. It's probably a change of use on the site. There is a reference in a local charter to a Caddes Minster, essentially in the village next door. We can't be sure that this is the site of Caddes Minster, but it's very interesting that no other part of our work identified sort of 7th to 9th century material, but the OSL did. There's definitely something happening there in the so-called Middle Saxon period. Quite frustratingly, I suppose, for us, is that the least visible bit of all of the archaeology is that kind of late pre-conquest and early post-conquest, the lordly phase that we're really interested in looking at. But actually, it's turning to some of the documentary evidence that suggests that we are looking at probably this binary residence and church relationship as we're seeing elsewhere, and that is it's partly down to the place name. The Saywins Burr of the place name is really significant. John Blair has shown that these SAE names appear almost exclusively after the year 1000, so the place name is really important for that. Interesting, Saywin seems to be at least one Munir, perhaps several Munirs, located in the southwest of England, named as Munir and Reeve in the mid to the 11th century, minting coins out of places like Bristol, Lidford, and elsewhere. Saywin is also mentioned as being Reeve of Bristol in 1066 as well. So this association with these Munirs and Saintbury seems quite significant. What might also be significant is that at 1066, the owner of the estate at Saintbury is Cynwyd Seller. This is an exceptionally rare name. It only occurs in the estates that he holds at Domesday Book, but also as a Munir minting coins out of London in the 1030s. So there's another association with Munirs and Saintbury here as well. Now, we can't be certain that this is the same person. The rarity of the name makes that slightly more likely, and we should thank Rory Naismith for his help in speaking to this about us. But it's interesting that Stephen Baxter has actually previously suggested that Chellas estates might have been held ex officio, that they might have been held because of a certain status. So we're just starting to wonder whether this association between high status, particularly Munirs, and Saintbury really might be quite significant, and maybe that these might be sort of a grace and favour property for high-ranking Munirs within sort of ministerial courts. Why that might be, Saintbury's got a very interesting sort of administrative history in the landscape around it. We're looking at quite a sort of a peripheral zone politically. It's at the meeting of 3 shires. It's also on the edge of the Diocese of Worcester, but it's also right on the edge of the Kingdom of the Wiltshire as well. So this is kind of potentially a contested territorial landscape, but also clearly a landscape in which lots of assembly was taking place. So there's at least 2 or 3 potential early medieval assembly sites in the immediate landscape. Saintbury's just located here, but just literally up the road is the Kissgate Stone, which is an assembly site, but also probably one at Kissgate Court as well. So it does lead you to start wondering whether the appointment of Thanes to Saintbury might have been associated with some administrative role or obligation in this case as well. The Kissgate Stone there is still there to be seen. This is the one of the early medieval assembly sites. It's interesting that this continues to be a site of assembly, that the Cotswold Olympics still held on Whitsun Week. It's been very much revived, but it was revived in the first instance in the 17th century by a person called Robert Dover. But I don't think it's a coincidence that he chose this landscape of assembly for this kind of county-wide celebration to take place. Often these things perpetuate much older places of assembly. Okay, I've whittled on probably for long enough. In terms of finding out more, we've got a couple of publications available. One in the Antiquaries Journal that was out only a couple of months ago. One slightly before that in the Medieval Settlement Research as well. Both of these are open access, freely available, but also quite an extensive database of material and archive on the ADS. Not only are the detailed reports of all the sites that I've mentioned, but also all the data sets, the geophysics, all the GIS material is freely available to download for you there. So to summarise then, the research on these lordly centres, as we call them, is traditionally being compartmentalised and to some extent overshadowed by the study of castles, especially early castles. Once we move away from kind of that preoccupation on defence, we do get a better understanding of things like their character, their function, and I think their significance. And you can start to characterize these places in terms of technologies of power, looking at not just the kind of churches and the residences, but also some of the wider assemblages that we see at them as well. Things like indeed the watermills and the sundials. It is very interesting how many of these sites are located on earlier antecedents. The issue of continuity or not is a tricky one, especially in the early medieval period, but that's a really significant thing that I think we're going to continue to explore in the book volume that I should mention as well, that we are currently writing and hopefully be out in a couple of years' time. Thank you for your time. I'll welcome any questions. I'll hand it over to the guys to chair those for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. That was fabulous. Thank you for the lecture.